you're dialing in from. I appreciate you dialing in with me here. This video is going to be about a certain topic that not necessarily a Bible study, so to speak, but it's about a topic that coincides with some of the events and people and places within the Bible. Occasionally, I'll make a video where we're talking about a certain person, a certain place, a certain event, certain times, to give some better understanding of what's going on with the stories and the outlines that are going on with the Sunday School series. And that's what this is. And ultimately, all of this is to get you to look at the Bible and get a better understanding of what God is telling us, leading us, and how to better use and implement this information into your life. So the video today we're talking about is leprosy. So just mention leprosy. I know you're thinking in your mind, okay, it's a disease. It's a skin disease and people hate it. They have to stay away from the public, and it's contagious, and they're just abhorred. And you wouldn't be wrong thinking that, but we need to, in my opinion, I like to look into the things that go on with people and how they get so desperate that they were willing to walk up to Jesus and ask to be clean, ask to be healed, and they would break all social norms to do just that. So why is it such a desperate act for them to go to Jesus when everything else fails? And that's one reason why I want to get into this lesson and talk about it. So, and also why God treats leprosy the way He does and how He instructs His people to handle it in the Old Testament. So without further ado, we'll get into it. So with leprosy, what is it? Basically, I'm not going to get into the scientific studies of that. I'm not going to get into the bacteria, the pathogens, and all that stuff. Nowadays, it's called Hansen disease. But I'm not going to get into all that detail. If you want to know that much information about leprosy, by all means, search it online, find you some good books and good source material, and study it. You wouldn't be wrong doing that. It's a common disease in the ancient world, and it's a severe disease. Back then, they just couldn't go down to the local Walgreens or dollar store to get some Tylenol and anything like that, antibiotics. That just didn't exist. So back in the ancient times, pretty much what nutrients you got was from your diet and little else, and of course the sun. But beyond that, you're on your own. So you lived and died based on what you eat. So it's a common and severe disease in the ancient times, okay? And looking at my notes, so if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. I'm checking out my notes. It had a long-term infection. It wasn't something that it's not like a common cold where you get it and then 48 hours you're good to go. No, it's a long-term infection of the diseases. It can cause nerve damage, muscle weakness, and the loss of limbs if you're not paying attention, because if your nerves are damaged, you can't feel anything. You don't know if something's going to happen to your limbs or the blood circulation, that kind of stuff. Poor eyesight, you lose your eyesight over something like that. Now, there are cases where you lose nose and ears and parts of your just appendages of your body. The symptoms may begin within a year, but the symptoms may take up to 20 years to occur. So, I'm 52, so if I had leprosy 20 years ago, it could start showing up now. And so that's what these people had to deal with. They could be residing, they could have that pathogen, they could have that bacteria in their body and wouldn't even know it until years later. And then it becomes a problem. So it's not as highly as contagious as you think. It's not like a cold or anything like that. You really have to be in close proximity to someone who has leprosy. The exchanging of fluids and that kind of stuff. I won't get into detail, but with leprosy, you really have to work at getting leprosy. So nowadays we kind of tend to stay apart from one another for good reason. Now family members are a little bit different, but you really have to be in the ancient world. They live in close quarters. They didn't have separate bedrooms like we do nowadays. Most dwellings, if you want to call it that, were just one big room. If they're lucky, if it was big. Sometimes it was small. You go in there to eat, get out of the weather, sleep, and everything else is outside. So in the ancient world, leprosy was a result of something you did wrong. It was a result of sin and uncleanliness. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in depth here in a minute. So lepers were considered the lowest of society. Basically, you did something wrong, and that's why you are a leper. It kind of reminds us of the book of Job. And what was his friends always telling him? Well, Job, you did something wrong. You need to admit your sin and turn back to God. And Job was like, no, I didn't. But back then, Job's friends kind of illustrate the mindset back then. If something's wrong with you, you're the reason. You did something wrong. You sinned. You're unclean. And so that's what. So they're the lowest forms. They're the lowest rung of society is lepers, and we'll see why in a minute. Leprosy not only affected the person who had it, leprosy also affected families, because if the husband ended up getting leprosy, that affected the wife, the children, the cousins, the brothers, the mothers, the fathers. It affected everyone. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more detail, but it was not just a physical condition. It was a social condition as well. And it had rippling effects, because a patriarch where it was just constantly, it was the male that was taking care of everything. The male gets sick, it could have dire consequences for more than just him. It'd have consequences for his children, his wife, his mother, all of those who depend on him for income. So nowadays, we have, it's still around. It's not being cured and it's not being wiped out. It's still here in modern times, but it's not as big and is not as big of an issue or a problem and it's not as severe as it was back then. Most of your leprosy cases nowadays, if I remember looking through some of the resources, again, multiple resources, just go online if you really want to find out where this is at. Most of these are in the third world countries and places and pockets of civilization where there's little or no cleanliness or running water or clean water. And so in those areas, you still have these rare cases of leprosy. And most of those people are poor and indigent where they can't get the help they need. And it's just something that they have to live with. And that's tragic for anybody to have to go through that. But it is still with us today. Not as prevalent in the ancient world, but we still have that. It's not completely wiped out. So looking at leprosy, so how does this, what does this have to do with the Bible is a good question. And why was it such a pariah? Why was this such a problem with God? Well, okay, let's stop for a minute and let's look back at the Old Testament, okay? And let's just, generally speaking here, if you look in your Bible, we go back to the time of the Pharaoh and the Hebrews who were enslaved in Egypt. They were enslaved, 350, 400, 300, 400 years? Probably 350, 400 years, depending on what timeline you look at and which scholar you want to listen to. But so you're looking at a people who were enslaved and lived in mud and lived in dirt and had little else. Their daily lives depended on building monuments and pyramids and that kind of stuff for the Pharaoh. So 300-400 years, these people were subjugated and lived building stuff, okay? Now, God, of course, saw this in his people, instructed Moses, and brought them out of Egypt and into the wilderness, okay? Now, let's stop for a minute and think, because this does have a point. If your child goes outside, okay, he's out there all day, he's playing in the mud, he's playing in the grass, he is sweaty, he is wet, he is muddy, he is nasty. Your first inclination is, you're not coming in my house looking like that, right? Especially a lot of you mothers out there. That kid's not coming in your house. You've probably been in that house all day cleaning, and you do not want that pig pen coming in and bringing in all that mud. Okay, so what are you going to do? Chances are you're going to hose him down, at least his feet, to get him to at least be somewhat clean, to get him from the front door to the bathtub, right? So That's how you got to look at this, okay? So God's ultimate plan, as we know, looking at hindsight, was God's plan was to bring his people out of Egypt and bring them into the promised land that he promised Abraham. So he is upholding his promise, his covenant with their descendant. But before he can give them this promised land, before he can bring them in the house, they got to clean up because they're filthy. And that's the problem here. So God brought them out into the wilderness. The wilderness is a good place because it's all sand and desert and mountain. They got nowhere to go. They can't affect anybody. They're alone. And God can address them one-on-one as a people. And the thing of it is, God's saying, okay, you guys are filthy. Okay? They came out of Egypt. They were a very carnal people. All they knew was what they felt and what they did with their hands. They probably didn't have much of a family structure, didn't have much in a belief other than these myths and stuff that they remembered from their father Abraham. And that was about it. They had no structure of belief. They had no organization, family-wise, community-wise, religious-wise. They had nothing. They were just kind of, like I said, they were a carnal people. So God's got them in the desert, and he's saying, okay, you guys, we need to clean you up because I can't give you this land as you're looking right now. You're looking kind of bad, okay? So that's where we are with that. So when we look at something now, 1 Peter, and you probably wonder, why is God doing this? Okay, 1 Peter 16 is written, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. God is telling us, I want you to be holy like I am. I want you to be like me. I want you to be at a point where we can interact and we can be together. God desires that fellowship with us. But guess what? It's usually our sin and our carnal knowledge and our carnal things that drive God away. Sin and goodness cannot reside in the same space. It just can't. So Peter emphasizes, be holy, for I am holy. And that's what God's going to do with his people. Now, so when we look at Leviticus, and you look at some of the books of Moses is a history lesson of what's going on, but it also gives us an idea of what God requires of his people. And what I mean by that, he requires them to get out of this mud, to get out of this carnal knowledge and this carnal thinking and this crude spiritualism, and accept me and let me put you on the right path to holiness. Okay? Now, it's very important that we keep that in mind. Okay? Because when we look at this, what we're saying is God is setting his people apart from the world. At this time, just about everybody was carnal. There's really no structure. Everybody had a base belief. They had their idols. And they had a crude structure as far as family, friends, tribes. And God's saying, I'm going to raise you up and we're going to make you set. I'm going to carve you out a kingdom. I'm going to make a land for you that I promised your ancestor, and I'm going to make a nation out of you. But in order to do that, you got to listen to me, because what I'm going to tell you is going to help you out. Okay? That's what God is saying to his people. He brought them out. So enough of that. So when we look at Leviticus and we start looking at these laws that God put in place, the laws were put in place for a single reason, to raise them up, to have them his people, okay? To make them into his people. The laws weren't just for how do you worship, what days you worship, and how do you go about it. No, if we read the Old Testament, we look at Leviticus and we look at some of these rules and we look at some of these laws that God has outlined. God discusses their diet, and he discusses how to stay pure. He tells them how to stay clean, okay? Well, how do you do that? God doesn't come out and say you need to bathe twice a day. No, you need to also watch what you eat, because what you put in your body is just as important of what goes out, okay? God knew that there was diseases in the land. God knew what he was dealing with when you eat certain foods, and that's why he said, I want you to stay away from this stuff because I want you to be healthy and I want you to be holy. So when we look at things like the outlines in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and we look at what Moses was telling and instructing the priests, and the priests were to get with the people, God was telling them, this is what you need to eat, this is how you need to stay clean, and this is how you stay holy. Okay? So you understand now what I'm talking about. God's telling them, this is what you need to do to survive, to be blessed. This is what you need to do. So the instruction was set sometimes in the physical term, but there's a spiritual meaning behind this as well. So the physical instructions outlined by God, basically saying, don't eat this, do eat that. Okay? There's a reason behind that. For one, you obeying God, and two, God's looking out for your health. He wants his people to not be sick. He is trying to curb these diseases that are going to be coming along. Now, that doesn't mean that he's going to completely eradicate all diseases. No, that's not the point here. The point is God is trying to make his people healthy, holy, and purified. Okay? Purity in the ancient world means you wash yourself with water. That's purification. Okay? So that's what we're looking at here. Now, God also knew that leprosy would still be a problem. Because if you read in Leviticus and you look at some of these laws that the priests have to go by, and what we have to, or what they have to go with, being around a leper is just as bad as being around a dead body in some cases. So it was very serious. You had things you had to do if you see a leper, and things you had to do if you touched a leper, and things you had to do when you found out someone was a leper, all that stuff. They even had rituals of what to do when you dispose of a body. Who does that and what? So God knew that leprosy would be an issue, but he was trying to minimize and tell his people, if you follow these things, not only are you obeying me, and I'm going to bless your efforts and what you're doing, but it's also going to take care of you physically. It's going to make you holy. It's going to make you pure. And these are the things you need to do. So, okay, moving on. So that's the reason why God said this is what we need to do. So they're out in the desert, and God's trying to make them into a holy people. Okay? So now when we look in Leviticus, the first thing we got to look at is what do they do whenever they encounter a leper? They found out there's a leper in their midst. Okay, so that's what we got to look at here. Leprous person who has disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose. And he shall cover his upper lip and cry out. So he must cover his face. He must cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean so long as he has disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. 13, verse 45, 46. The leper is then considered utterly unclean physically and spiritually. So we have an outline of what goes on. Now, if you read more of Leviticus, and I'm not going to get into the minutia of the text regarding exactly the steps taken, but in summary, you go back to Leviticus 13. What we have here is, let's say, for instance, someone comes up and says, hey, look, Aaron over here, he's got leprosy. Well, the priest will first go and evaluate Aaron. He'll take him, somewhere, and he'll examine him, every inch of his body, to find out if he has leprosy. Okay? If it's determined that Aaron has leprosy, Aaron is instructed at that very moment to leave the camp. Okay? No, he can, if he's got something he can take with him, that's fine, but he's got to go. He's got to go out of the camp. Okay? He's got to go out of the camp, and later on he has to go out of the city. He cannot be with the populace. He can't be with the people because he's going to affect people. So Aaron's got to get out of the camp. That's the first step, determining if a person's got leprosy. So there is steps that the priest must take to determine if a person is a leper. All right? So now, Aaron is banished from the camp. He lives and resides outside the camp. That's step number 2. That's where Aaron's going to spend the rest of his days as a leper if he's not healed. Now, Aaron is outside the camp. Now, he's not banished from his people. But if anybody were to come around at all, I'd have to yell unclean, unclean to remind them that I'm a pariah or Aaron's a pariah. Okay? Now, and in some cases, I would have to be, or not me, but Aaron would have to be the disease considered so revolting that a leper wasn't permitted to come within 150 feet if the wind was blowing. So that's how precise they are in regards to how they deal with lepers. You know, if the wind's not blowing, okay, you can be within 6 feet of me where we can talk. That sound familiar? We did that with COVID. So, but if the wind is blowing, guess what? You got to back up 150 feet. And then yell at me if you want to tell me something. How tragic is this? This is pretty tragic. So this person who may be a good person got this disease and determined that he had it, and he had to live outside the camp. Okay? Now, I say good person because most of the time when they say that leprosy is a result of sin, they're right. And what I mean by that is a person was probably eating or drinking something they weren't supposed to. They were not eating the right foods as God has outlined for them. Because remember, they came out of Egypt, no structure. You don't know what they've been eating. You don't know how they were living. But God knew, and God said, this is why in the desert, you're going to clean up your act before you go into my house. Okay? So, and some people slip back into those old ways. Now, that also means some other things that they were doing. How people would sleep with one another. Those diseases run rampant as well. If someone was constantly sleeping around and people were always sleeping with this person, that person, this, you know, those bodily fluids and that stuff for swapping around. So you get my point. So a lot of times it was sin that brought about this condition. So now this person is outside, Aaron is outside the camp, step number 2, we're still on this. And he is, for the most part, it's a death sentence. Let's be honest. Unless your diet is strong enough to where you can overcome that disease, and that disease, like I said, it is a slow disease. So it's not like, you know, you're going to be out there for a couple of days and then you're allowed back into camp. No, if you got leprosy, you can pretty much count on being out there for a long season and maybe years, okay? And if by some chance, some miracle you survive, well, let's say a couple of 6-7 months later, you're starting to show that you don't have leprosy. You let the camp know that you don't have leprosy. Then a priest will come and evaluate whether or not you do not have leprosy. They will inspect you. And guess what? There is a long ritual step process that person would have to go through to come from outside the camp to outside their tent to get into their tent. Okay? So there's always something. If someone made it to step 3, hallelujah. I have nothing to base this on, but I would say that step number 3 rarely happened. Okay? But God has outlined every possibility in Leviticus for his priests to follow if someone was to have leprosy. And it was very important that it was acted upon because you don't want that kind of disease spreading among your members. Could God just heal all the lepers? Yes, he could. No doubt about it. But a lot of times if you're healing someone, you're not healing their mind or their problem, and we'll get into that in a minute. For the most part, again, if it's your sin, if you're eating the wrong things, you're drinking the wrong things, and you're doing the wrong things, you're sleeping around, or you're doing some kind of activity that causes this to happen. Bestiality was a problem back then as well now. So you see my point. God could heal his people in a moment's notice, but they needed to heal their hearts and minds. They had to be holy for him. So anyway, so we move on to that. So that's why God instructed his people about the cleanliness, the diet, and how to live. And that was very important for us to look at when we look at something like this. So now, let's fast forward that to the New Testament. Now, there's several instances where Jesus is dealing with lepers. And he's healing lepers, okay? Now, the next lesson that I'm going to be doing on Mark, Jesus will encounter a leper. And give away the story, he heals the leper. But when I was sitting there and studying that lesson, and I read about how certain lepers came to Jesus and what they did, I don't want to get into that lesson just yet, but it takes a lot for someone to step out of their comfort zone and to do what these lepers did. And let me explain what I'm talking about. This is a society that is ingrained. Lepers lived on the outskirts of town. They lived in the wilderness, okay? And guess what? They lived with other lepers. So again, if they're living with other lepers, there's a very slim chance that if you're living with other people who are diseased as well, you're not going to get well. You're pretty much relying on the goodwill of others or your own family, okay? So this man that comes up to Jesus and begs Jesus, comes to him and just drops down on his knees, says, make me clean. I look and I think about that, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this video, is because just imagine what kind of desperation, what kind of brokenness, what kind of just hurt did this man have to endure to come to this point? How long was he a leper? Months? Years? His whole life? And there's no telling what he lost. Did he lose his family? Are they gone? Did they move on? Chances are, if a man's got leprosy and he can't take care of his family, someone else has got to. And so the family's got to move on. And one day it could be that the family can come out there every couple of days to talk or leave something behind for them, food or whatever, water, and talk to them at a distance, and that would be as close as they were going to get. And then guess what? One day it turns out that you're just seeing them once a month, then every holiday, and then you just stop seeing them altogether. Your kids are grown and gone. They got to take care of themselves. And they can't worry about daddy over there in the leper colony. And you also got to think the family's got to deal with the stigma that someone in their family is a leper. That's not something, again, lepers are the lowest rung of this society. So they're not really looked upon, highly regarded. So when I see this man, I read about this man coming before Jesus, and Jesus is moved and motivated to help this man. And I kind of get a glimpse of Jesus and how he felt about that. So these people who are lepers that come to Jesus, they're coming to Jesus because they're hearing all of this talk of healing, and there's hope, and that's something that they have not had in a long time. These people were living with leprosy, disease. They're just I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that. And everywhere they go, they got to yell out, unclean, unclean. They got to cover up because of the disease and the shame they must feel. And so we look at that and we wonder, when they leave, they're just so shouting for joy and they're just so happy for Jesus healing them. They're not paying attention to the instructions that he gave them. And we'll get into that with the lesson and we'll understand why. But I understand the praise and the uplifted spirit of the leper when they're healed. I understand that. Jesus did something so immediate that ended years of pain, sorrow, brokenness, disease. It's just unreal, okay? So I kind of understand that they would just kind of lose their minds for a minute and want to praise Jesus. It'd be hard for me not to. I can't imagine that going on. But in this society, when Jesus addresses these lepers, he's not just addressing the disease. Most of the time, he's addressing the sin. When they talk about make me clean, they don't talk about heal me. They want to be clean. And that's the important part. They want to be accepted. They want to come back. Not only do they want to be healed, but they want to be holy. They want to be with God. They want to be with their people. They're basically saying, please give me a life. That's the most important thing that we got to remember. So when these people that you're reading about in these lessons, and you hear about leprosy and you read about leprosy, think about those people for a moment and realize just how broke they are, how sad they are, how much they've lost. Now, on the flip side of that, we take the story of the 10 lepers that Jesus healed. Okay? Look at that story. Go back and look at that. How many of those lepers came back and thanked Jesus? 1. Well, that's terrible. You mean to tell me the other 9 were not grateful? Now, we don't know what happened beyond that. It was a point that Jesus made to his disciples that, look, I healed 10 and only 1 came back. What's up with that? Okay? So where are the other 9? Now, beyond that lesson to the disciples, we don't know what happened to the other 9. We don't even know what happened to the healed leper, the one that came back and talked to Jesus. We don't have any idea what happened to those 10 lepers. But in my mind, and looking at some of this stuff and reading on leprosy, this is my opinion. I got nothing to base this on other than my imagination. I believe that those 9 lepers who were healed went right back into the lifestyle that got them into leprosy to begin with. Maybe all 10 of them, I don't know. But chances are, and knowing human nature, knowing how we are, those 9, they probably were, we thank you, Jesus, we appreciate that. Now I can get back to my old life. Well, guess what? Your old life is what got you in there to begin with. Your old life is what caused you to have leprosy to begin with. You were doing something you weren't supposed to be doing. You were eating, you were doing your lifestyle, something. You were sinning to a point that caused you to have this disease. And I would dare say, again, this is my opinion. I don't have anything to go on. You may have a different opinion, that's fine. I would think that those 9 would go back into the lifestyle that they had right before they got leprosy. That's just an opinion of mine. That 1, who knows? He may have changed his life around, but obviously what Jesus told these lepers to do, to go to the temple and all that stuff, they just didn't do it. Okay? So chances are, some of them, and there's a lot of them that he's healed, that we see that they are jumping for joy and they're praising Jesus and they're telling everybody, but they're not following Jesus' instructions. Why are they not following Jesus' instructions? We're going to get in that in the next video. We're doing the Gospel of Mark in the second video. I'll explain all that coming up. But for now, I just wanted to give you a brief history, a brief outline of just what this disease is, how God addressed it, and why he addressed it the way he's done. Okay, so when we start seeing some of these lepers in the Bible, we kind of have some idea of what they went through, what happened, and why they were so thankful and they gave praise to Jesus. So, all right, thank you for tuning in and watching the video. We appreciate it. Please find us on the website. Go to our website and contact us. If you got any prayer requests, you got any concerns, please send it to us. Facebook, go to Webb Baptist Church. You'll find us there. Leave us a message. Talk to us and let us know what you think. And if you got any comments or anything like that, bring them to us. We welcome to what you're saying. You got to say to us. We thank you for tuning in and watching with us. And we enjoy doing these videos. Hopefully we'd like to see you here Sunday morning at Webb Baptist here in Webb, Alabama. If you can't make it to this church, please make it Sunday morning to a Bible-based church. Get involved, get plugged in, and become a thriving member of that church. Okay? Until next time, take care. God bless.